it looks as if the Ukrainians are succeeding in making the Russians think that Crimea, the defense of Crimea, air and land, is a, a cost on the military budget of munitions and reinforcement too far. And they are really psychologically in retreat there.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And this time we're joined by a defence editor with 55 years experience as a broadcaster and journalist. Robert Fox has reported from several conflicts, including the Falklands, the First Gulf War and the Balkans. He's worked for the BBC, the Daily Telegraph and authored many books, and he's now the Evening Standard's defence editor. Robert Fox, great to see you again. Welcome back to Frontline. Let's start with the battlefield situation in Ukraine. And in a recent interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer, Ukraine's head of military intelligence said that the frontline situation will remain difficult till at least mid-July, until Western military assistance arrives at scale. He said there'd be no Armageddon those. So where is the greatest threat in your view on the front line?
Well, I think you've had a very eloquent account from Kirillov-Budanov, but Kirillov-Budanov is probably the most adept around in psychological warfare. He is absolutely brilliant at now you see me, now you don't. A friend of mine went in to interview him just a few weeks ago, and he has a wonderful map which shows Russia as an imploding volcano. And it is very much Budanov, but he's right. I think there's a lot more going on, and it's very interesting that he doesn't want to say. I mean, he's one of the real brains, by the way, behind the defense and the military initiatives in Ukraine. He's at least as important as the commander-in-chief, Syrskyi. What I think that they're watching is an extraordinary play out of the reverse of what happened last year. Last year, we saw a real attempt at a summer offensive, too comprehensive, too wide by the Ukrainian forces, and it ran out of steam. We're seeing the same from the Russians this time, and it's running out of steam, but for very, very different reasons. And it's very strange. I've just been reading an assessment by Mick Ryan, the retired Australian general, a very good military analyst, and he comes up with one simple statistic. Russia is losing far more on the battlefield than it can possibly replace, at least in the short term. Now, Mick's view is that in the medium to long term, that situation gets worse. So what Putin is facing is a long drawn out war and a long drawn out stalemate. Both sides are readying for it. On paper, Ukraine is the weaker. Psychologically, it's the stronger.
So, accepting what Mick Ryan's analysis is, it would be right to say that Armageddon isn't the Russian goal along the front line at the moment, because simply it can't do it anyway. So is its goal to stretch the Ukrainian forces where it can?
Absolutely. That's why there is so much activity along the front. We've had a real push around Kharkiv, which seems to have run down. Now, Ukrainian forces are actually slowly gaining ground back. Russia is slowly nibbling away at ground. The further west you go, a lot of activity around Zaporizhia, a lot of activity out of Advika and Bakhmut, the big battlegrounds of last year, and some pressure in the west, which is, of course, as we know, is critical on the Kherson front, which is a very, very damaged environment because they flooded the area there, and where the dam burst, it's not good fighting ground. So this is the ground war. We've got to add two more things to it. What's going on with Crimea, the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, the marine factor, and what is happening in the air, where there are very, very big question marks. But to go back to your piece is that that there was a real effort over Kharkiv. I don't think they ever wanted to take Kharkiv. They wanted to possibly bypass it, invest it. It's a very big place to bypass. It's the second largest conurbation in Ukraine. Now, what has happened there is that the American lifting of restrictions on attacking into Russia has really helped. They're using long range, medium to long range weaponry, which is really having an effect, as far as I can see, on the Russian logistical effort to resupply the front line. So, in fact, the Russians in the Kharkiv sector are going back. But what they're trying to do elsewhere, and they're playing the game, but the most interesting one is the battle in and around and access to Crimea at the moment, because by the latest reports, and that is over the last few days, that again, the Ukrainians are neutralizing access to Crimea across the Kerch Bridge. And they're not necessarily doing it with blowing things up, although they've had a good go at that. They've done it by computer hacking, and the traffic control computers seem to have been very badly damaged. There's also a lot of activity in the Sea of Azov, the inlet to the northeast of Crimea, whence Russians have been launching from ships Iskander missiles, medium range cruise and ballistic missiles, and that seems to be a target area. Can I conclude, because I think there's a rather dramatic conclusion to this, is that it looks as if the Ukrainians are succeeding in making the Russians think that Crimea, the defense of Crimea, air and land, is a, a cost on the military budget of munitions and reinforcement too far. And they are really psychologically in retreat there.
So, what do you see happening in the coming weeks with Crimea?
I think that the Ukrainians will keep going. It's where they're showing that they're the most at their most innovative. They've been very successful with surface water drones and with undersea drones. I think we're being very coy in that there's been a lot of British and Royal Navy assistance and training there. There have been very successful commando operations in and around Crimea, so much so that they have really begun to write down, as we've seen with the strikes right in the center on the old port of Sebastopol and so on, that they've managed to really write down the air defenses quite a lot too.
So,
So
if the
it's not,
Ukrainians are delivering, sorry to
yeah.
interrupt, but if the Ukrainians are really delivering a psychological blow to Russia over Crimea, what do you think Russia will do? Do you think they're going to decide it is not worth the cost of defending it?
There's two problems there. One is the military assessment, which may say that we want to make our main effort elsewhere, and we don't want to divert too many naval and other and air resources to Crimea because it takes it away from the main front, which they still intend to push on. But it's also a fixation with Putin. It was his first big gain when he annexed a Crimea. It's sort of, Crimea is his sort of Mary Tudor's Calais, written on my heart. It seems that, and it's go. One cannot see Putin, and it's not appeared in any of his rather strange offers for peace negotiations. One cannot see him ever conceding the possibility of giving up Crimea. If he does, by the way, it means he's also lost the Black Sea. So it's a really difficult one, and it's where I think the Ukrainian forces can balance their very obvious weakness, which is in manpower above all. They're finding it very difficult to conscript. It's going badly. A lot of people are dodging. The forces on the front line are exhausted. But my friend Luke Harding of The Guardian, who's just come back from the front in the Kharkiv sector, and he said, as happens often in these things, morale gets higher as you get closer to the fight. Curiously, they know it's very difficult. They know that they're outgunned by the Russians at the moment, but they're still doing ingenuity. That is the point about doing the ingenuity piece, is that the Ukrainians seem to be tactically so much more innovative than the Russians, although the Russians have adapted in very big and important areas, particularly electronic warfare.
So, on that subject of the battlefield shortages that Ukraine is suffering, it's according to the Associated Press has done a report saying that they've extended the draft to include prisoners. Some 3,000 already been released on parole, and apparently 27,000 could be eligible. But no convicted rapists, it says, or those who've murdered two or more. I mean, what do you think of this move?
Desperate moves. I mean, they've got to do something. They know that because a lot have gone into hiding. A lot of young men have escaped the country. They get temperamentally not suited. I mean, it's such an interesting and strange war because, I mean, Luke gave at a presentation this week such a graphic account last week, a graphic account of the battlefront. And 1 minute he was talking World War Two and World War One, genuine trench warfare, rivets, and so forth. And the next minute, it's all drones, it's all electronic warfare. And he'd seen on the monitors that the Russians are finding it, as would this happened with the Ukrainians last year. You cannot move tanks and armored personnel carriers, let alone dismounted infantry, across open ground in any shape or form if there is a significant air and drone presence. And that's what Ukraine has really got to build up. And that's where the allies, and particularly the Americans, have been neglectful in their on off approach to supporting it. But the F 16s are arriving soon. There's not nearly enough of them, but it could change the quality of the air battle, which is critical.
Let's just talk about the glide bombs because President Zelensky has renewed calls for more air defences, long range weapons. He says they've been targeted by more than 800 guided aerial bombs in a week, and that he wants the US position to shift to allow Ukraine to strike deeper into Russia, to hit the aerodromes where those planes carrying those glide bombs land. Uh, I mean, do you think that is likely to happen anytime soon? At the moment, they can reach perhaps with drones, but what he really wants is a long range missiles to strike them.
I think they've got the long range missiles, or they could arrive very soon. The problem is Bidenism. I think why we have Biden's embarrassment, he's got to play on that. But actually, they've got smart people. Yeah, I find this absolutely ludicrous. And I think, the second guessing by the American commanders, the American advice, strategic and tactical advice has been absolutely excellent. But the strategic, when it becomes mil-pol, military political, has been ludicrous. You don't run wars like this. It's, you can do this up to a point with a really good weapon, but by the way, you'll have one hand tied behind your back. It's been and it's been pointed out to the Americans by their allies, not least the Brits and the French, and I should think the Nordics. If you are trying to restrain things at the moment because you don't want to provoke Putin, you're actually laying in store possibly an even worse and tougher battle in the future. And by the way, this is where I disagree with a lot of the commentators. I don't think it's going to change that much with Trump. I think Trump will try and change it. And I think his military, the overwhelming military advice, and there are things that his allies can say to him that, that we're not going to play it all your own way. You've got to come into the middle. You've got to support us. I mean, what Trump doesn't know or refuses to know, I'm sure he does know, by the way, is just the effort that powers like the Poles, the Finns, the Nordics, and the Brits and the French have really put in. They put a lot of people in to help in Ukraine, in and around Ukraine. And I think that has to be said now. They're not fighting, but they're advising, they're supplying, they're looking at plans as much as the Ukrainians will let them look at the plans. They didn't let them look enough at the plans last year, by the way, and that was a problem because they'd have said no, no, no. But I think that Trump, against his better instincts, if he does become president again in November, will have to be more collective. Will have to be more. He will need allies because he needs allies above all for the Pacific, for the target date of 2027 and China, and possibly the date to really make a military effort on Taiwan. And America can't do that alone. It really needs friends right across the world.
Robert, let's talk about Russia's new security deal with North Korea, because I know you've written about it. It included a deal to send engineering and construction troops to Russian occupied parts of Ukraine. What does this tell us about, in turn, about Russia's manpower problem?
It's terrible, and there are terrible reports coming out from the occupied areas of the Donbass just in the last few days since the North Korea visit, where they're getting civilians, where they're threatening them with taking all rights, access to medical facilities away. You've got to have a Russian passport. You've got to have, it seems, in cases that they're transporting them, particularly children, of course, as we know, back into Russia. It's a mess by all accounts. That you discount some of this too. Obviously, people like Budanov, who we've mentioned, the intelligence chief, effectively the number two in the in Kiev's forces in the order of battle of Ukraine. They're making the most of it, but the reports from inside are really pretty dreadful. They're having a dreadful time in the occupied Donbass. Hence your point about military personnel and I think other personnel. I think that what Putin was wanting, I think probably tens of thousands of North Korean laborers to go in and help out, because it isn't just the security on the Ukrainian front, where he boasted, involved in the Ukrainian campaign, there are now 750,000, but they need a lot for the security in the enormous, stretched out security problem that they've got going right across deep Russia, particularly as they face the borders with China. It's not that they're facing confrontation, but they are facing civil unrest and disorder in a lot of these places in the deep steppe. And I think that that's what they're saying. They need lifters, they need logisticians, they need low-level security guards. And I think that it was so clear that they trumpeted the big deal with Pyongyang when he went to visit Kim Jong Un. That was all known about. We knew they were getting weapons. They knew they were talking about mutual defense agreements, and they were very clear to say this is only for defensive and not offensive purposes. And then you got these whispers, you got these unofficial accounts. Oh, they're talking about labor. They're talking about getting people in, which I think didn't please the Chinese too much, too.
You described that security agreement as a dance of the desperate. But for those who do get alarmed when Russia does its nuclear saber rattling, how advanced do you think North Korea's program is? Because the fear is that in needing help from North Korea, how far will President Putin go in helping North Korea's nuclear program?
Quite a lot, I think. And I think that's what Kim wanted. Because they have made advances. But have you looked at the latest firings of missiles? They've not been going too well from North Korea. There is something I mean something megalomaniac about Kim's posturing, and they do want these global missiles. They want technology from China, and I think China, by the way, has been very careful about it, but very, very long range missiles. Now, if they get into bed with Russia on that, I think that is extremely worrying. We've heard a lot in the propaganda about the hypersonics, the Kinsal missile, for instance. It hasn't been that effective in Ukraine. That's the kind of thing that they'll be working on together, because it is a main effort by the North Korean arms industry. I just don't think, as I said, I just want to add as a footnote, and it's not a little footnote. I don't think China can be too keen on all this sort of the dance of the desperate between those two, because China has a very clear strategy, and it's much more focused in some ways even than Putin, because Putin drifts off into fantasy with his strategic thinking and planning, and sometimes China really does know what it wants, and it doesn't want that strategic view of the world, that strategic plan, upset by loonies, frankly.
Tell me about Belarus, because I mean, its defence ministry is now claiming that Ukraine is reinforcing its troop presence along its border with Belarus. Something, of course, that Ukraine dismisses. How do you see what's going on here? I mean, they're also, saber rattling with their potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, etc., even if they have them. I mean, is this part of Russia's extended information campaign? Do you think that them saying this, or is it preparations potentially for a false flag operation?
It's been a flaky ally, Belarus, but I think they like having it there because, in a way, Belarus and now Georgia is what Putin really wanted Ukraine to do under Viktor Yanukovych. Remember him, who was ousted in 2014. It was to be a hollowed out, semi-independent satellite. That effectively is what Belarus has become. Very poor, in a terrible mess, quite physically. And we should not forget Chernobyl here, where dreadful things have been going on, and dreadful things happened there at the very beginning of the invasion of Ukraine, which has just come to the fore. They stationed troops there, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And some of them are probably just dead now from radiation. They're doing the same in Georgia, by the way, with this pro-Russian stance, anti-foreigner, anti-NGO. It's exactly what he had hoped Yanukovych would do, turning Ukraine to greater dependence on Moscow instead of being forced by vote to associate more closely to the EU as it was by that time. Your point about Belarus, that Belarus is saying that it's usually quite the reverse. The idea that Zelensky is going to invade Belarus, but what they're going to make damn sure, and it's very clever again, and this must be the thinking of Syrskyi, who is now the commander in chief in Ukraine, who was very adroit in the defense of Kiev, which was masterly, and it was really wonderful improvisation. They knew roughly what they had to do, but the improv in the first 6 weeks of the war is going to be a textbook studied for ages. Now, what Syrskyi and Budanov and Zelensky and their team must be saying, for God's sake, we mustn't be open to a sudden attack, just walking across open ground, coming in from Belarus in the way that they did in Kharkiv earlier this year, where they came round the defenses and there weren't enough defensive forces. Remember the Russian concept of operations as Maskarovsky, where it's deception, gross deception, in a pure tactical military way. You probe here, you push there, you pull back, you move there, you punch and you feint. You sting like a butterfly or float like a bee. No, it's float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, as Muhammad Ali said. And they thought psychologically, you see, this is where Gerasimov got it, the Russian commander got his name. Well, we did it brilliantly with the invasion, the infiltration of the little green men in Crimea. This is where these people, like Zaluzhny before Syrskyi, they were schooled in Soviet doctrine. So they are watching the deception game. And I think that they must worry. There are 3 centers that Putin has been open that he wants to attack: Kharkiv, Odessa, Kiev. And they are saying to themselves, we won't take our eye off the ball with the defense of Kiev. And that's why they will reinforce the border, and they hope to rattle the regime there, which is not as steady as it looks. And I said, this reporting that's come out lately is what happened to those troops. They stationed forward troops. It was a forward a forward mobilization base in Chernobyl. And they went even into the red zone, which is polluted. And reports have been reaching me in the last week that some of those soldiers there are now dead from radiation.
There's going to be so much that
Yeah.
comes out still to come on the reporting of the consequences of this war in the years to come. I'm sure of that. Let's just talk about briefly about the French parliamentary elections, because the first round of voting puts Marine Le Pen's populist right national rally within touching distance of power for the first time. Now, a lot of it, if her party, I mean, it's not won yet, but if her party wins a majority, if Trump is president again, with Kremlin-friendly Viktor Orban of Hungary now presiding over the EU presidency, who can Ukraine count
Mark
on?
Rutte,
Yes,
the new.
the new Secretary General of NATO.
Uh, I was about to say, pardon the pun, he's a fox. Mark Rutte, 57. He's actually, he said, "Oh, I've had it with Rob." He never does that. He's very laid back. He is the onlooker who watches the game before he acts. He will be very good. He won't be as in your face as the very forceful Scandinavians like Rasmussen and particularly Stoltenberg have been. We know he knows how to work around people like Robert Fico, who he squared away for his candidature, and Viktor Orban. And I think that Mark will see his role um, as really pulling NATO together as a credible alliance. And what he will be telling the Europeans is that you've got to be really credible in a way to turn down Regulo 5 on the Macron rhetoric won't be a bad thing at all. He's been a touch Napoleoniste. I don't think this strutting young figure telling Europe what to do. And he did see himself as the leader of the EU pillar of European security. We won't have that now. The European EU security depends on NATO. And that will be absolutely clear. And somebody like Mark Rutte understands that very well, because he was very cautious about Ukraine at first, and then through absolutely the weight of the Dutch government and even the new one that's just come in as we are speaking, I don't think it will pull back from support for Ukraine. After all, they've been on the front foot in supplying the F-16s. I think that the French situation is not as bad as people make it out to be. I think part of the real problem, which will drive people nuts dealing with them, is that French politics for the rest of the Macron presidency will be quite incoherent. Because I doubt if Le Pen and Bardella will get a majority. Gosh, we're waiting till next Sunday, and we'll know. And the awful thing is, forgive me, my Italian friends, but they're going to end up with an Italian solution. The Italian solution would go like this: that they have frequently had non-majoritarian governments. This means, and they may well face a similar situation, though from a different direction in the Netherlands, where a government cannot stick to a program, but has to put, it happens with minority government, each measure each time and can stand and fall by that. And I think that that's why there will be a cohabitation, but it'll be a cohabitation of the weak in France, and it's going to be very difficult, because one of the things that has not really come to the fore about Macron's difficulties is how in debt they are. I mean, he could talk, we've got to talk a big fight. And it's the same with the Brits and the Germans. The Germans put 100 billion euro into defense, but they're all running out of money now. And this is simply not good enough. The UK budget, as we speak, the chiefs are being told to consider £1 billion worth of cuts in order to facilitate this guarantee year after year, 3 billion for Ukraine. It's pretty powerless at the moment. Putin will have a field day on the propaganda front with all of this.
He certainly will. And we're speaking, Robert, a week before NATO's 75th anniversary summit. Mark Rutte, who you've already talked at length about, but in his final speech, he did urge support for Ukraine. At the summit, what do you think is the best outcome next week for Ukraine? Because it needs a lot more than just warm words, doesn't it?
Yes. And I hope that they don't go into the tepid bath of warm words, which they generally do on these occasions. I think the real work has to be done behind the scenes. And the real work has to be done between the twin towers, sorry, the twin pillars of Brussels. It has to be done between the EU and NATO. It sounds mad to say this 2.5 years into the war in Ukraine. They need a strategic plan for Ukraine. It's been hand to mouth. Oh, Biden says we can't do that this week. And it's been all over the place. One feels very sorry for the Ukrainians. They've got to say, we need to do this, this, and this to hold the line. We need to do this, this, and this to bring the military situation to a culminating point where the Russians realize they can go no further. And we need to do this, this, and this to stabilize and ensure a dynamic future for Ukraine. And at the moment, what's being offered from Russia, that you will get rid of the government. Well, I'm prepared to have peace. Putin was saying, we'll get rid of the government. We don't want Zelensky, neo-Nazi rubbish. And we want we want a bit more territory, and we want a guarantee forever that you won't join NATO or possibly even the EU. He has no idea how sovereign nations operate in that way because he is just fixed on Putinist Russia.
Do you think there's any chance of having? Do you think there's any chance of having this strategic plan anytime soon that you talk of?
I think it's going to depend on somebody like Mark Rutte, some really shrewd old bird. He's not an old bird. He is really quite young. I think you get bright people behind the scenes in small teams doing it. These sort of 60, 70 nation peace possible conferences in Switzerland. You get a bit of money out of it, but generally it's a lot more bureaucracy. It's vapid. And that's the sort of thing that's got to stop because we've got actual crises proliferating and how they will go, what will happen. Look at the synergy of Georgia, say, Moldova, more activity in the Balkans. Are they going to do something provocative out of the Kola Peninsula in the north, the Russians? And you've got Gaza and Lebanon as well. This is what they've got to take on board. And the other thing is where they've got to accept the reality is that that it's rather like the boasts in the British defence papers, like the Integrated Review, we're a global power. No, the alliance stops being local now. It has global interests and will need to have global reaches. There are things that it will have to do. For instance, I'm talking about NATO now, the reinforcement of Cyprus and the Eastern Mediterranean. Now it's being directly threatened by a ballistic missile attack from Iran and the alliance of disruption. Iran, North Korea, throw in a few others, Russia, China. And that's what it's got to address. It can't look back on 75 years of maintaining glorious peace in the Euro-Atlantic area from the Atlantic to the Urals. As it said, no, it goes far more, and it goes above and below. It goes into space, it goes into cyberspace, and the sub-aqua domain is absolutely vital now. But it's got to be practical rather than rhetorical.
Robert Fox, I think you've just booked yourself for another 10 conversations with me in future. It's been so great talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. My thanks to our producers today, Louis Sykes and Morgan Burdick, and for you for watching. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now, or you can listen to Times Radio for the latest news and in-depth analysis, or go to thetimes.co.uk. For now, though, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.